Gong sound. Welcome to the Zachrilege Cast podcast, YouTube video interview program that features me talking to some of the best and brightest in the atheist slash secular slash awesome community. This is episode number 95. We're recording live on May 11th, 2017. I would like to thank my guest from last week, Dustin Dark, for being on. Find him on Wayward Atheists and on Facebook and see if he can hang with the Canadians. So tonight's guest is the former co-host of Miami Valley Skeptics, the first atheist podcaster to interview Answers in Genesis. Wonder how many answers he got. And his latest project is Who Do They Say That I Am? A documentary unraveling the mystery of the historical Jesus. Welcome aboard, Matt the Attack Kovacs.
Matt the Attack Kovacs. Thank you. That's an MMA fighter, so if you Google me, that will come up first. So
Yeah,
glad you gave a shout out to whoever that guy is.
you got out Googled, but it's okay. These things happen. I do want to show.
That's actually okay.
Considering the topic tonight, your documentary, historical Jesus, it's time to bring on the real Jesus. My light kind of sucks, so even more Jesus from Evil Twin Brewing. This is a stout that is a lot closer to the color that Jesus' skin probably was than is usually depicted. Perhaps we'll discuss that tonight. I saw you had some, was it Gatorade?
Yes.
Working.
Yeah, Gatorade and water. So.
This is like a business trip for you. So Matt, what can you tell a little bit like your personal background, like personal religious background, all that stuff?
Sure. I was raised fundamental Baptist, so I have a lot of roots in Calvinism, ultra-conservative Baptist. I would consider myself no longer a Baptist. If anything, I'd consider myself probably an atheist. So which is a long story in and of itself. I was raised, like I said, I was raised Baptist, raised as a literalist, meaning I thought the Bible and the Gospels without error, 100% historically accurate. So that it kind of is what did it in for me. I want to say did it in for me. That's kind of what started to unthread the foundation of my religious beliefs. Because if you're honest with yourself, once you start reading, take for example the Gospels, reading them side by side as opposed to one after another, read them, this passage in Mark, this passage in Matthew, etc. You can't, and if you're being intellectually honest and honestly seeking answers, you can't say they're 100% historically accurate. So at the time, that really bothered me, especially when I found take for example, the resurrection passages. If you read them side by side, as opposed to right after each other, they're just almost an impossible cohesive unit. And Dan Barker from the Freedom for Religion Foundation has this wonderful thing called the Easter Challenge, where he will challenge people to make one cohesive resurrection story using all four accounts. Because in essence, if you take Mark, which is the earliest resurrection account, you have two women at the tomb and they see a young man, not an angel, or not what we're sure to be an angel. And there's no Jesus at the tomb. In fact, there's really no physical resurrection in Mark. Then you go to Matthew, and then there's this big earthquake. There's a stone in front of the tomb, and an angel rolls away the stone. And then if you go to John, then Jesus is actually at the tomb talking to Mary. So being honest with ourselves, it's clearly not meant to be a historical biography, or at least it can't. All four can be interpreted as that. So when that was the first contradiction for me as a Christian when I tried to piece those together, and I really struggled with that. That if we can't trust the Bible, then what else is there? So I started researching more. I started reading about astronomy, Richard Dawkins, and eventually it just got to the point where I could not honestly say I believed in God. And the interesting thing was during all this, I was working full time in the Christian ministry. I worked at a Christian camp year-round. It was a year-round Christian camp and retreat center, and I was working there full-time. So while working there, I started to lose my faith and become an atheist. So I had to be honest with myself. I can continue doing something which I think is unethical, which is forcing children into a guilt trip to commit a decision, a life-changing decision, which they're not old enough or smart enough yet to make that decision, and that bothered me. So I had to make an ethical decision as an atheist to leave that camp and do something else. So I left the camp and, went from there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I've got the live chat going. Actually, I have two people on. Jeannie's on, number one fan. She got mad at me earlier this week because I traded one of her beers away. But I got two beers in response. And I have someone named Darth Dawkins, who I don't think is a fan of atheists, but that's okay. We invite all people to chat. He thinks he's probably agreeing with those pastors you had on, and they make more sense if you agree in advance. So how did you kind of get started with podcasting? You're involved with Miami Valley Skeptics, which I believe I listened to a while back. I don't know. Is it still there?
We don't still do it. I think you can still find the archived episodes somewhere. I'm not sure. It's been a while. We just did a Christmas episode back in December, but we quit doing that. And then Eric Mittler, who is also a co-host of Miami Valley Skeptics, we decided to do this project because it was both an interest of ours. I started the project as a mythicist, believing that the most parsimonious answer was Jesus did not exist. And through this project, I would say I now lean toward that the most simplest answer is there is a historical Jesus at the core of the origins of Christianity. I think that's the most honest position, and I know I'm in the minority there when it comes to atheism, or the atheist community. But I think people, if they're looking at the evidence and understanding the right questions to ask and actually understanding the arguments and the experts and not just being in an echo chamber of specific mythicists, then I think they will come to the same conclusion if they're honest with themselves.
Well, that's why we all have to listen to the show and check out the film. So did you just decide when you were working on the movie, hey, I'm going to do some podcast episodes to kind of get people excited, or you just, hey, I do a podcast, so why not?
Well, yeah, Eric and I, we wanted to release some prologue episodes because we want to put out some information and some content because it's a huge project. We've been working on it for almost 2 years now. And every time we think we're getting ready to release it, we're like, okay, it's not finished yet because there's more questions to ask. And we keep getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's an episodic documentary, so it's not just one episode. Because in order to tell the story of what we're trying to tell of us going on this journey, it requires more than a 2-hour show. It's a ton of information, and in order to fully grasp it all, you have to split it up into segments. So it's almost in the vein of an episodic documentary because it's just, like I said, it's so much data and content in order to do it justice and do the arguments and the scholars and the archaeologists. To give them a fair shake, we have to give them more time because it gets pretty deep, when we're talking about, the first century Roman history and first century Christianity and going back, even before then. So there's a lot of content there.
Well, how did you get your team together to work on the documentary?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, Eric, who's the co-host, has a background in classics and Greek history, so it's already a passion of his, early history. Our academic advisor, Daniel Galuta, he he was on our show, and he actually debated David Fitzgerald, who's a mythicist who wrote Nailed and Jesus Mything in Action. So on our old podcast, My Meteoric Skeptics, Daniel Galuda debated Fitzgerald, and we brought on Daniel, asked him to be our academic advisor because he has a lot of connections through his time at Yale. Now he's going to be at Stanford working on his PhD. He has a lot of connections and just very knowledgeable about the academic community. He's one of the best we're going to get on this project. So he's the guy who kind of just helps us find who to talk to. So like we'll interview somebody and we'll have questions about some claims they made, and we'll go to Daniel and say, hey, who's an expert on crucifixion? Okay, you're going to talk to this person. Who's an expert on coined Greek linguistics of the 1st century? You know, these very specific experts. He's the guy who gets that for us, because when dealing with these arguments and trying to investigate these things, you need an unbiased approach. So, for example, trying to understand if the account of the crucifixion seems accurate, we're not going to go to a scholar. I'm not going to go to an apologist. I'm going to go to a person who is an expert in the medical field, who has done research on Roman crucifixion, who doesn't have a say one way or the other, and we'll ask them. So we interviewed someone who's done peer-reviewed work and experiments with cadavers on crucifixion, and asked them to say, how reliable is this account, you know, of the crucifixion? Would Jesus's body actually go through this and go through that? And it turns out the Gospels have a fairly accurate representation of the process of crucifixion from what we can understand about modern science. That's kind of how we pieced it together, is we just try to find as many experts who can seem unbiased as possible. Like the expert we talked to on crucifixion, I don't know if they're Christian. I would assume so just by statistical chance, but we didn't even ask them their views on Jesus or religion, because that wasn't the point of the interview. The point of the interview was discuss science behind crucifixion and that process.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, this whole subject is a tough one to take on, because there is so much riding on somebody's personal religious beliefs that it's going to taint a lot of it. So just trying to find out anything that you feel is like an unbiased source has to be tough. So I really appreciate all the effort. So that's
why. Go ahead.
This whole project started. Well, you go ahead because you're the guest. You should talk. I should do this.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that's why we interview everyone from Richard Carrier to Frank Turek, and we have interview offers out to William Lane Craig, to Dale Martin at Yale University, the widest spectrum and the largest collection of scholars and experts under one project. So we're not just going for a mythicist angle or an apologist angle. We're letting them make their arguments and then going to other experts to weigh those arguments and letting the audience kind of hear the arguments. Because if you ask your average person, why do most experts hold this position in any field in biology, a lot of them really don't know. That's the whole problem with the argument of authority is, for example, the historical Jesus question. It's an overwhelming consensus that Jesus existed. So why do they hold to that position? But then we go a little deeper than that and take apart the specific arguments. Why do people think, Jesus was buried in a tomb? Was he buried in a tomb? What's the evidence for that? If Jesus had his tomb, was he buried in a mass grave? Was he taken off the cross? Did Jesus have a brother named James? Things like that. We go answer these questions that, for example, the passage Paul, who wrote the letter of Galatians, makes a comment about James, the brother of the Lord. And Dr. Richard Carrier, who is a mythicist, argues that was more of a generic title. So we take that claim to linguistic experts. in first century Koine Greek or Pauline linguistic experts, and let them, again, not asking them one way or the other, are you a mythicist, are you not, just understanding what you understand about linguistics, how would you unbiasedly interpret this passage, and getting their answer from that. So that's why I think it's the question isn't so much did Jesus exist, it's breaking apart the argument that if Jesus existed, what would history look like, or how would you have to interpret the passages? If he didn't exist, how would you have to interpret the passages? And again, the James, the brother of the Lord, in Galatians is just an example of that.
So after your extensive study, do you believe brother actually meant brother, or was it a spiritual term?
No, I don't think it was a spiritual term at all. I think it means one of two things. It either means Paul thought James was really the brother of the Lord, or it was a title in the early church. Just because if you read Galatians, the argument goes so much that in Romans, Paul says, those who are in Christ are brothers and sisters. In Romans, Paul says that. So in Galatians, Paul says he went to Jerusalem and met with Cephas, the chief apostle, and James, the brother of the Lord. The issue with that is Paul's giving titles. He says Cephas or Peter, then he meets James, the brother of the Lord. Paul mentions other Christians, Paul mentions other Jesus' followers, but he never calls anyone else by the name James, the brother of the Lord. James is the only person who has that following his name. So it would seem very peculiar that Paul's audience would interpret that any other way, because you have to understand who is Paul talking to, who's Paul talking about, because the entire letter of Galatians is these people who thought they had authority by James came into the Galatia church and were telling them they're worshiping wrong, and this made Paul very upset. So this person James had authority, or at least claimed to have authority, and Paul is referring to him as James, the brother of the Lord. So clearly he wasn't just a generic Christian, and I think the audience he was writing to would interpret that as person is the brother of Jesus. Now again, what specifically does he mean? Or the closest we can get is Paul went to Jerusalem and met somebody who claimed to be the brother of Jesus. Whether James actually was the brother of Jesus, we don't know, but it's most reasonable and most parsimonious that this guy James was walking around Jerusalem claiming to be the brother of Jesus. If it was a generic term, he would call other people like that. Let's test the hypothesis, and this is how science and history works. It has to have predictive qualities, it has to have explanatory scope, it has to meet criteria of dissimilarity. So if you have these, take for example predictive quality, okay, brother of the Lord was a generic term, we would expect Paul to mention other Christians by that name. Okay, let's examine the text. He never does. If it wasn't a generic term and it meant something specific like being the brother, he would only call a specific individual this name. Okay, he does. Which one meets predictive qualities? Well, that one right there meets predictive qualities. Criteria of dissimilarity. How would his audience interpret that? What evidence do we have his audience even read Romans? Because the only way you can get Galatians to mean generic is you have to assume his audience was aware of Romans, the passage in Romans, which there's no evidence to indicate there was. So I guess my point being, without going too deep, using historical and skeptical methods, the most simplest answer, Occam's razor, is he meant he was the guy's brother, physical brother. And history works in simplest terms. What's the most likely explanation?
I think you've made a great point. We can't know what the original Greek was for brother from another mother. That would be a good one to use. I don't even know, like the literalists, do they still believe that Mary was like a virgin her whole life? Because then the whole brother thing might be a little questionable.
It depends. Catholics believe Mary was a perpetual virgin. They hold to the position that James was Jesus' half-brother by Joseph, not his physical brother. Protestants don't hold that Jesus was, or Mary was, a perpetual virgin, so James would have had actual brothers. In Mark chapter 6, Jesus has brothers. He has a brother named Joseph, he has a brother named Judas, he has a brother named Simon, and he has a brother named James. Very clearly, Mark, the author of Mark, put down that Jesus had brothers. So Catholics would hold to the position that those are step-brothers or half-brothers, that Joseph was married. The problem with that is it's nowhere in the text. Again, you have to understand the audience. You can't add stuff into a historical text to make sense of something 2,000 years later. You have to try to interpret it through the lens of the audience. How would someone in the first century interpret Mark 6 about Jesus' brothers? That's how history works. Yes, it could, if Joseph existed, if Mary actually existed, those were his real parents. Yes, he could have had a stepbrother, and Joseph could have been married before, but it doesn't exist in any text. So how could history say that's reasonable or not? Because clearly Mark's audience didn't interpret that way, so you can't assume Mark meant it that way.
Yeah, so what does that do for the employees of the Ark Park who made up names of the wives of, was it Noah's sons? I forget.
Yeah.
Women didn't get a lot of names in the Bible. I don't know why that is.
No, women did not, because women in that culture were, especially the Bronze Age, when Genesis was written, women were second-class citizens, or they were less important. They were there as pretty much concubines. So it doesn't surprise me that Noah's sons' wives didn't have names. But the Ark Park Answers to Genesis, they made up names, and some of them gave them like Disney names. Ariel, I think, was one of the names, and he actually said he gave them those names because his daughter likes the Little Mermaid, I think. So, but I think that should be telling to them about the position of women in the Mosaic Law and under, the Torah. Testament stories, what you would call the Old Testament stories, that not very many women get names, with the exception of Esther and Ruth, and obviously Abraham's wife, but they're just not that important. The important thing is the male lineage, which makes the Jesus story quite interesting. The fact that he doesn't have any male lineage, depending on which gospel you read, he doesn't have male lineage. He just has female lineage.
Yeah, he does. He does and he doesn't. Okay, we're about 20 minutes in, so I want to do my first live read. I feel like I promised months ago that I would give my Patreon special love, especially those who have their shows of their own. So let me tell you, they moved in a way that is oh so sexy. No religion required is part of the Wednesday Spreaker Power Block, 8 p.m. Eastern Time live, or on your own podcasting app of choice. They had Trey Crowder on this week, y'all, so check them out. Talk about attack of the Southern accents on that one, so that should be fun. So back to the show. Matt, do you think all mythicists are cranks?
No. Some are. Some apologists are cranks. No, I have a lot of respect for Richard Carrier. He's a smart guy. David Fitzgerald's a friend of mine. Him and I talk often. Just because people are unpersuaded by your argument does not mean they think you're stupid or they think your argument is stupid. I am unpersuaded by David Fitzgerald's arguments in some areas, especially his peculiar reading of Mark. That doesn't mean I think he's unintelligent or I don't have respect for him. He's done a lot of research into his new book. There are some mythicists that are cranks. I've talked to mythicists who believe Paul didn't exist, or Josephus wrote some of the New Testament. People who make claims, dubious claims without evidence, are cranks. Just because you can make a good claim and you present an argument and someone's unconvinced by it, it means you need to understand why that person's unconvinced by the argument. The problem with mythicism, though, is it doesn't just go against a scholarly consensus on whether the story of Jesus existed. In order for, take for example, the celestial Jesus mythicism, that Jesus existed as a celestial being. In order for it to build that argument up, it's not just a consensus on, for example, Jesus existed or not. It's a consensus on all these little things. Every consensus has to be wrong. The James, the brother of the Lord consensus has to be wrong. The understanding of interpreting Mark 1:1 completely has to be wrong. The understanding of the ascension of Isaiah has to be wrong. So all these independent experts who don't care whether Jesus existed also have to be wrong. Now understand, arguments from authority is a fallacy, but there's something to be said there when every consensus in different fields and different independent experts all have to be wrong for your one theory to be correct. To me, that seems like that's irresponsible to assume without doing the proper research your theory is correct. And I'm going to assume anyone who makes these claims aren't experts in all these different fields. Does that mean you're 100% wrong? No, because history deals with what's most probable. So breaking down the mythicist argument, which is what we did, all of these different experts who don't care whether Jesus existed also have, where the consensus is overwhelming, almost nearly 100%. Like take, for example, dying and rising messiahs, or did first century Jews expect a dying and rising messiah? Independent experts who aren't Christians, who are Jews, who are Muslims, would all disagree with that. But the celestial Jesus mythicist theory would hold, no, they did expect a dying and rising messiah. Or take, for example, like we brought up the James, the brother of the Lord passage. Independent linguistic experts who don't care whether Jesus existed or not, or who don't have a dog in that fight, would agree this is how you should interpret it. So people who aren't experts in all these different areas have to go against the consensus. I have trouble buying into the mythicist theory. Can experts be wrong? Absolutely. Can a vast majority of independent experts in independent fields from all different schools of discipline be wrong? Yes, but again, going statistically, we're getting to a smaller and smaller and smaller probability. So are mythicists quacks, or are they like creationists? I don't think all of them are at all, no. I think Richard Carrier is a very intelligent person.
Yeah, I need to check his book out because I just finished. I noticed that Dave Fitzgerald did the rounds. He was on a lot of podcasts, but I doubt that most of them read all three of his books because it was a lot of book. Well, I would say it's books. The third part definitely felt like its own book. But I finished, and I found it intriguing, but I will admit that I kind of want mythicism to be true just because it's kind of nuts that Jesus is such an important figure and there doesn't seem to be that much. Well, then again, there doesn't seem that much about other historical figures that most people agree exist in that time period. I don't know. That might be,
and it depends. It depends on who we expect Jesus to be. And take Mark, for example. Read the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is a peasant who never makes an impact, who is just a blip on the radar for Roman society. He barely shows up in the Gospel of Mark. It's not until afterwards his followers are the one that makes this a big deal. If Jesus existed, you would not expect him to show up or anyone to notice him. If someone did notice him, as much as someone would argue you should, I would be skeptical of that. I would expect people just to notice his followers more than him, because I don't think Jesus predicted his death. I don't think he expected to be crucified. I don't think Jesus thought even he was the Messiah. If you read through the Gospel of Mark and break that down, I think Jesus thought he was carrying on the work of John the Baptist and was just preaching one in a dozen messianic figures, preaching the end times. But what we do have, though, see, this is the question we need to ask ourselves. What is the most plausible scenario for the origins of Christianity? We do know there was this movement that appears to start around 30 to 50 CE. What seems to be the most plausible scenario in which this movement appeared on the scene. We know Paul was writing about 50 CE, and he claims there were followers of Jesus before him, assuming Paul is not completely making the whole thing up, which we assume he's not, because there were Christian. By the time we get to Paul, there's Christian sects in Asia Minor. There's probably some in Egypt. We know there's some in Jerusalem. There's some in Rome. So by the time we get to Paul's letters, there's these little small pockets of this Jesus movement, which it was still a Jewish movement by the time it gets to Paul. So where did it come from? How did it start? That's the question we need to be asking. Not, well, if Jesus existed, he would have made a dent in history. He could have. We don't know that. That's putting the cart before the horse. The first question we need to ask is, what's the most plausible scenario as to the origins of this Jesus movement by the time the 30s roll around? And I think the most plausible scenario obviously would be there's some guy who had some followers who got himself crucified, and after he was crucified, they started this movement and started attributing things to him which already existed in their Hellenistic culture and influences.
Yeah, it gets harder and harder to even relate and try to think about what it was like in those times, because there weren't newspapers. Most people were illiterate. According to the stories, Jesus was illiterate, never wrote anything himself. And now every person with a cat has, like a YouTube channel and gets a lot of attention. And you think, well, of course, but yeah, in that time when Rome was kind of the center of the world, here we are in a little bit of a backwater. Even if he did half the stuff that people say he did, it would have taken decades probably to.
Yeah, you have to understand that the way stories moved and news went from one location to another, it takes time. Like Jesus being a lot of the. Take, for example, I keep going back to Mark because Mark's my favorite gospel. In order for Mark to get those stories about Jesus, if he got these stories from other people, it spread orally. So Mark is hearing these stories decades later, which is what we would expect. If Mark was writing a year, even 5 years after these supposed events, we should be skeptical of that, because that's not how information traveled that quickly. Mark has gathered a lot of stories about Jesus. And yes, some of them are exaggerated and some of them seem to be legendary, which is what we would expect over 3 decades, 2 decades, however, depending when you date Mark. So, but I think the fact there are some historical aspects to Mark which you can cautiously dig out. But the fact that Mark has such a low view of Jesus, such a human view of Jesus, shows us that the early followers of Jesus had a very low view of him. Not low as in he's a horrible human being, but low as in he wasn't God. I don't think Jesus thought he was God. I don't think his first followers thought he was God. I don't think Mark's audience thought he was God.
Is that the low Christology versus high? Sorry to interrupt.
He is, yes, the level of deity, I guess you would call Jesus, is because in the Roman culture and in Hellenistic culture, which the Jews were heavily influenced by the time we got to the Second Temple period, Jesus' day, there were levels of deity. In our culture, we think you're either a God or you're not God. You got to think, though, you have to understand Hellenistic culture. There are levels of being a deity. A Jew in the Second Temple would view probably Moses and Elisha as a deity. That would be blasphemous to a Christian today. Like, what are you talking about? So Jesus seems to evolve to different levels of deity until you get to the point, well, you get to what's called monotheism. There's one God. So if there's only one God, Jesus can't be a God, but not God. But if you have what's called monotheism, which is there are different gods, but only the God, the Jewish God, should be worshipped. Jews during that time were monolithic, which means they believed in other gods, but there was only one God that should be worshipped. So again, Roman emperors were gods. They weren't the God. Jesus, at some point, could have evolved or been ascended to a godly status. Humans like Moses, or Moshe is what the proper term I want to call him, he ascended to a status of a deity. Now, was he God? No, but he was what we would consider a God. They wouldn't use that term. So over time, Jesus, his followers kept trying to make sense of this. And if he was the Messiah, he would have been ascended. He would have been adopted. Like you have this term called adoptionism. Some scholars think Paul was what you would call an adoptionist, which means Jesus was a human. Then at some point in his life, he was adopted as the Son of God. He was a human, and God, the Father, bestowed upon him a level of deity, which you can get that out of Romans 1, where it says Jesus was marked out to be the Son of God at the resurrection. So some scholars would argue that means Jesus was adopted to be the Son of God at the resurrection. Also in Luke, some early manuscripts of Luke at the baptism has God the Father telling Jesus, after Jesus is baptized, by saying, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Again, that almost an adoptionist view that now that you're baptized, now you're the Son of God. You weren't before. And you even get that in Mark at the baptism too. Because in the story of the Jesus' baptism that we all know, Jesus goes to John the Baptist, gets baptized, he comes up, and the dove flies down and lands on Jesus. And you hear the voice from heaven saying, this is my son, in whom I'm well pleased. But that's not what happens in Mark. And most people don't understand this because they don't go back and read the Gospels side by side. In Mark, Jesus is the only one who hears the voice. And the voice says, you are my son, and now I am well pleased. So again, Jesus, and you could interpret that, and I would think most likely what that passage is saying is Jesus is being told, now that you're baptized, now that you're ritually purified, because that's what baptism was, now you're my son, and now you're the Son of God, because that's where Mark starts. Mark starts his gospel at the beginning of the Son of God, or the beginning of the good news of the Son of God, and then he gets baptized. Then the dove and the voice, which only Jesus can hear, says, you are my son now, in whom I'm well pleased. And then you get to the other gospels, and then it changes to the voice is heard by everybody. This is my son. So it's peculiar to me they would change that. The later gospel authors would find whatever reason to change from Jesus being told specifically and only Jesus being told, and to now the audience is kind of being told. It completely changes the context. Like if I'm telling you something, like saying, you are my son, but then I say that same, you are my son, this is my son, it's a completely different to be read in that. And I think, again, I think Mark had Jesus was an adoptionist. In fact, I think probably John also, which this is a very, was probably an adoptionist too, which that's a huge, long discussion. But just being honest in reading the text. So going back to Christology, so yeah, you have these different levels of Christology in the Roman culture and the Hellenistic culture and even the Second Temple culture. Someone said, when Jesus says, you know, almost makes what you would think are godly claims, you have to interpret that through the lens of a first century Jew and understand saying you're a deity doesn't mean you're God. It just means you have a different level than being a human. You know, angels are deities, things like that.
Well, I mean, there were 7 layers of heaven, weren't there, according to that? It's like
Depends
a
on,
cake in the south.
Depends on the type of Jew you were and things. You know, some like the Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection at all, and the Pharisees did, or the Essenes believed in different levels of heaven. So yeah, there were so many different types of Judaism floating around in the first century that, and yeah, but Paul wrote about 7 levels of heaven, and he went up to the 3rd level and things like that. So, but I don't think Jesus probably, again, I don't think Jesus made a lot of the claims attributed to him just because it wouldn't make sense in the context he was living in. It only makes things he says would only make sense. Like, for example, this whole where Peter is talking to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Do you agape me?" Peter says, "No." She says, "Do you agape me?" Peter says, "No." And saying, "Do you love me?" Do you love? And you have the different in Greek. You have agape love and all these other different words for love, right? And Jesus is saying, "Do you love me?" "No." "Do you love me?" "No." And he's using different words for love in Greek. The problem is Jesus didn't speak Greek. Jesus and Peter spoke Aramaic. So this wordplay Jesus is doing with Peter in Greek doesn't make any sense. Because they didn't speak Greek. Again, that's one of the tools of a historian is the Gospels were written in Greek. So you have to put the word of Jesus back into Aramaic and see how they fit. And if it doesn't really fit, then you would say he probably never said that. Like the conversation with Zacchaeus and John, saying this concept of being born again. It really, that play on words, born again, translated back into Aramaic, doesn't make sense. It just doesn't fit the context of speaking in Aramaic. So in order to understand as much as we can about the historical Jesus, you have to know as much about the culture he lived in, as you can.
That makes sense why people have been studying forever. And because I heard your interview with on the anthropology, and you were talking about the belief about how Jesus was buried, if he just basically decomposed on the cross, or he was actually in a mass grave. My second beer is from Burial Brewery in Asheville, because they haven't sold out to the big boys yet. And this is Bolo's, the coconut brown. I have to say, I'm sorry, Jesus, but I think I like the coconut brown better. But I still have other Jesuses. And I got to get David Fitzgerald on, because I did read his book to get I'll get the other side of the story. See, he'll get to listen to you and talk smack. He won't talk smack about you because
no, I know David pretty well. Him and I message each other quite often. So,
well, let's get a little bit about your kind of show, talking about your future, documentary and all that. Because you did like a 2-part episode talking about the Price-Ehrman debate. Mm-hmm. Was this the Mythicist Milwaukee one?
Yes. We did their after show.
I saw one, and I didn't know, because I feel like they've done a couple. So
it was the Ehrman Price debate, yes.
Did you enjoy that, and what was it like getting some of your experts that you've talked to together to talk about it, and all gang up on David Fitzgerald?
Well, yeah, if I could do it again, I wouldn't have them all gang up on David Fitzgerald. That was kind of Fitzgerald just kind of called in, and I would have done that differently. Especially, I wasn't very aware of McGrath's and Fitzgerald's past when all that went down. They had a past.
Okay.
So, yeah, it was fun though. I was glad I could get those experts on and discuss it. In hindsight, I wish it was more balanced because, like you said, I felt like Fitzgerald was very respectful, and he took everything they said and he really didn't lose his temper, and I'll give him that. So he earned my respect from doing that panel, and just
the whole thing with David Fitzgerald, like even from reading his book, he's like, well, this is what I think based on my studies. You can probably change my mind, and he's probably done so many of these, and he's been kind of the underdog because, as you mentioned, the mythicists, they are not so plenty, and he isn't quite, because Richard Carrier and Robert Price, they actually have the credentials. They are historians. He says he's an historian. He's doing, I don't know if it can be compared to what you're doing, but it's kind of like
I would say
what he's studying what other people have done and kind of interpreting it for the masses, which is necessary because it is overwhelming. I mean, even, you talking about, well, they wrote the books in Greek, but they actually spoke Aramaic, and it's like translating languages to languages. All of a sudden we have this crazy game of telephone that's just impossible to figure out. That's why this has been That's why we're 2,000 years in the future, and people are still like, I don't quite know what's happening here. I don't really understand it. But someday,
that's and I really don't want to say too much about Fitzgerald since he's not here to defend himself. But yeah, I think David does a lot of research. But if anything, and I've encouraged him this too, I wish he would speak to more experts and people like Dale Martin at Yale University, and break down their arguments specifically. Like why does this scholar hold this position and understand the arguments, or why does this scholar specifically say this? Because there are no. Let me rephrase this. There is one teaching scholar today who is a mythicist, and that's Robert Price. Now, there are some agnostics, and we tried. I honestly tried to find mythicist scholars, and I found two agnostics, Dr. Hector Avalos and Heidi Wendt, and those are the agnostics. So it's such an overwhelming consensus. The only one I could find is Robert Price, who is a scholar by trade. Yes, Richard Carrier has a PhD, but he doesn't teach, and he doesn't have a PhD in, early Christianity or a religious PhD. He has it in Roman history, which is a good PhD. But to be fair to the academic community, we try to find academics who are mythicists, and the only one we could find was Robert Price. And in that, Price goes back and forth between being a Gnostic and a mythicist. So, hold on one second. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But I guess my point being,
it happens.
Yeah, we tried to find mythicists as much as possible, and again, we found some. But just because there's only one mythicist out of 1,000, for example, I don't think it's quite that much. But just say, even if it was that much, that doesn't mean the arguments are wrong. But what we did was we went to different scholars and experts and heard their arguments and said, okay, let's see if this argument makes sense compared against this. We didn't just hear the mythicist argument and say, oh, well, this makes sense to us. Let's find evidence to support this argument. Instead, I went to people like Dale Martin. I went to people like Adela Collins, people like Matthew Baldwin, all these different scholars, and asked them, what's your argument for this? And let's discuss that. I think that's something I wish more mythicists like Fitzgerald would do, is interview experts in all these different fields and understand why does an expert like Adela Collins, an expert in Mark, why would she say the way you're interpreting Mark is wrong? Go to her, and not saying go to her because she's right, but go to her to understand what convinces her that this is the way Mark meant his gospel to be interpreted. Things like that is the only thing I think he should do differently. But again, I'm not here. He's not here to defend himself, and I would consider David a friend. So,
well, I'll have him on and talk to him about some of this stuff. Let me do my second live read, and we'll get back to this.
Yeah.
I'm trying to give love to people who follow me and support me and all that, so I'm going to do that. If you support Marissa McCool, you will see visions of flying purple Amazon volleyball playing transtastic writing and podcasting machines. Check out Inciting Incident and RisMcCool.com, and I'll have all the links to the supporters on the show notes. Well, do you think that because... I mentioned that the question I asked earlier about the mythicists being cranks kind of came from that episode you did, in which the historians on I guess the people who think Jesus really existed, came down on the mythicists to a level of climate change denialists, people who believe in a flat Earth, creationists, that kind of thing. So, do you think because mythicists are kind of they're definitely considered fringe, do you think the people who have the mainstream view even want to give them the time of day at this point?
I think the reason some mythicists are being labeled climate change deniers or creationists is their arguments. Someone made a meme and asked me to release it when I didn't, about using quotes from David Fitzgerald and using similar quotes from Ken Ham. I thought it was very dishonest. But in talking to scholars, when a mythicist says something like scholars can't come out as mythicism because they'll lose their jobs or they're contractually obligated to hold this position, that's an anecdotal claim which has no evidence to back it up. It's just hearsay. And you say, well, what are some of these? Well, I don't know. I can't name any, but they're there just because they're contractually obligated to believe in the historical Jesus.
Well, I mean, in David Fitzgerald's book, he listed like 5 people who lost jobs because of their beliefs now.
He
I mean, I'm sure you could go into it a little further than I can.
He mentioned, for example, Mike Licona at Liberty University. If you talk to Mike Licona, again, you're cherry picking data, I think. Yes, people lost their jobs, but why did they lose their jobs? Why did Mike Licona leave Liberty University? Is it because he did not believe in the historical Jesus anymore? No, Mike Licona is a pretty conservative person, very ultra conservative. Gary Habermas, conservative. People lose their jobs in academia all the time for bad scholarship, bad science. It happens. But to say the majority of scholars, or a good portion of them, only hold to that position due to a contractually obligated position, is that literally, word for word, is the same argument creationists use against evolution. So it's not so much what you're saying is wrong, it's the structure of your argument is flawed. It's almost an anti-argument from authority. Or by saying, that's, I wish I could remember some of the specific arguments during that conversation, but and I'm not saying they're right or wrong, so don't say I'm defending that position. I'm just trying to clarify, because I don't think maybe they were very clear when they do make these claims. But it just seems like the arguments are weak. Like I think it was McGrath in that discussion who even said, if this is the best mythicism has, it has no place in academia. It's not so much that mythicism doesn't have a place in academia, it's that it has to carry its own weight. Take, for example, even if people were fired, and even if Licona was fired because he became a mythicist, that doesn't mean mythicism should automatically have a place in academia. It has to do its due homework. It has to do its hard work. It has to pass peer review. It has to make strong arguments. It's not just a matter of, we shouldn't just blindly accept any theory just because someone comes up with it. That's not how science and that's not how history works. We can't just say Jesus was a hippie, and he built a time machine and went back to the 1st century and talked about peace. Well, in order for that to be taken seriously, of course, if I was in academia, I would be fired if I started teaching people this, teaching my students this, because even if I was tenured, they say sure, if you can provide evidence and pass peer review, your crazy crackpot theory wouldn't be crackpot. With Licona, who Fitzgerald mentions, and who I've had some, I actually talked to Licona. He was teaching at Liberty University, and he was talking about, what was exactly the resurrection, I believe. It was something not. Oh, it was the it was the dead saints coming out of the grave. He argued that was an apocalyptic metaphor in an apologist class at Liberty University, and he would not stop. Pretty much wouldn't stop teaching that. So that had nothing to do with the historical Jesus. It had nothing to do with his academic credentials, or it had to do with what Liberty, a private university, wanted to teach its students, and they wanted to teach biblical literalism. I think an example like Licona is not an honest example of a professor being fired for having a different position than what the university was comfortable with. And Bart Ehrman said this to us private. Well, I guess not privately because I'm about to say it. That if he wanted to make a lot of money, if he was honestly in it for the money, he'd be a mythicist. You know how much money he could make if he came out publicly as a mythicist and wrote a book? He said
I don't know if I totally agree with that, just because mythicism is such, it's on the fringe. And right now, Bart Ehrman's cranking out books like, seems like every 6 months he got another book, and he's doing just fine. But he's sliding. The one thing that I found interesting about, and it may have been the mythicist, maybe another one. I don't know if he and Price have done multiple. They're obviously or know each other.
They've only done
well.
that one debate.
But Ehrman did mention that over time he actually didn't believe in the tomb that Jesus was born or was put in. And I don't remember if you disagree with that. That I don't even know if he thought that Jesus basically was just left on the cross, or if he actually was buried in like the mass grave, as you mentioned.
Ehrman now holds to the position after research that Jesus most likely was left on the cross and was never taken off the cross. I disagree with that. Here's the thing that is quite frustrating sometimes. Bart Ehrman is not the only scholar. In fact, he's not the best
very
scholar.
Well known. Yeah.
Yes. He's the Neil deGrasse Tyson of scholarship. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a great astrophysicist in certain areas, but he knows enough about the subject outside of his expertise to speak to it from a layman's point. And Ehrman knows enough about specific subjects where he's a good introduction. Ehrman's expertise is manuscripts, early Christian manuscripts. That's his expertise. He's not, now again, that's not to say he's a layman in any of these areas, but his main focus, it's like Richard Dawkins is an expert on evolutionary biology, but he could probably, he does a good layman's expert or a layman discussion on philosophy and in morality and atheism, but that's not his where he shines at. Like if you read The Selfish Gene and read The God Delusion, you can tell which one he's more passionate and knowledgeable about. The Selfish Gene is a much better book than The God Delusion, just because that's his expertise. When Ehrman writes about things like early New Testament manuscripts in his book Forged and Counterforgery, which isn't that popular, but that's his expertise. So Ehrman has some ideas that are against consensus, like was Jesus left on the cross? That's not consensus. And I personally think Ehrman's wrong. Now, I can say why I think Ehrman's wrong, and I can say because these are the scholars who would make good arguments, and these are the arguments, because we examined that actually in the documentary about Jesus on the cross, because it's a very important tool to understand the Gospels. So I don't just blindly say Ehrman's wrong. I feel like I can ask Ehrman some tough questions about this scholar says this, and this is why I think that's the most simplest answer. And I can go into that if you want as to why I think Ehrman's wrong on that issue. But
you can just say Ehrman's wrong. That'll just Ehrman's wrong in your face, Ehrman.
Yes, he's not. It reminds me of when a Christian argues against atheism and they appeal to Richard Dawkins. And it's like, Richard Dawkins is not the Pope of atheism, and Bart Ehrman is not the all-knowing biblical scholar. There's a lot he doesn't know, and there's a lot that goes against consensus, he thinks. But that's not to say he's stupid. It just means do your research. If you're going to appeal to Ehrman all the time, then on subjects which he's not the expert, that tells me you probably haven't done your homework to know who to talk to.
Well, I listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and he often says it's hard for him to decide where to start when he's doing a new project. How do you determine when your documentary is done? Like, when do you think you've had enough? You could talk to experts probably for the rest of your life and not scratch the surface. There's just so much here.
I think we're just about done. Obviously, I think we're just about done with it, and we're pretty much done doing interviews at this point. But how do you decide when we're done? When we feel like we can get as close to the answer we're trying to seek as possible. And that answer is, who was the historical Jesus? Without giving too much away, I think the closest anybody can get is, who did the first followers of Jesus think that he was? Not who Jesus thought he was, not even who those first followers were. But obviously Jesus had first followers. Even if you're a mythicist, somewhere along the line, someone was the first followers of this Jesus figure, even if they made him up. So as close as one can get, honestly and historically, is who the first followers of this Jesus character was. And the evidence seems to me to indicate the first followers of Jesus thought he physically existed. They seem to have thought he was a historical person. So if that's the closest we can get, responsibly and intellectually honestly, we have to say more probable than not he actually existed. So once we got there to who those first followers were with confidence and what we can know about them, there's the answer, and that's the core of the origins of Christianity. So that's kind of where we decided, okay, at some point, about halfway through the documentary, this is where we need to go. So how close can we get? And that's not to say there's people who don't claim to know what Jesus thought of himself. I think we can know a little bit, but everything we know would come from followers of Jesus. And those would come from other followers, and those would come from other followers. You just kind of have to follow the rabbit hole, and hopefully you can get as close as possible.
Let me invoke Dave Fitzgerald one more time, because in the last third book that he did a little H.G. Wells time machine. Mm-hmm. So if you decided you had a time machine, you had the ability to see Jesus, when in the past would you go and where would you go to find him?
Oh, geez, probably around 30 CE. But I wouldn't be so much interested in that. Yes, I would be interested in meeting the historical Jesus, but I would be interested in probably a decade before that, because what interests me personally more is the culture and the society which made someone like Jesus feel like he was a necessity. Yeah, I would go to 30 CE if I wanted to find the historical Jesus, in Galilee, of course, but Jesus was a product of the times he was living in, a superstitious time of people who felt oppressed, that they were God's chosen people, but for whatever reason, they were being overpowered by the evil rulers, which they probably thought was Rome or whatever they thought it was. And that is what Jesus just happened to come around at the right time, at the right place for all this to occur. He came right after, right after, I'm losing my train of thought. It's late here. I'm tired. Forgive me. The Hasmonean. The word I'm looking for is Hasmonean. He came right after the Hasmonean dynasty, and then Herod the Great, right before the Romans completely destroyed Jerusalem. So he literally fit within this perfect time period. I think if he existed anywhere else, nothing would have happened. Christianity wouldn't be here. It just coincidentally the right place at the right time and gave people something to grasp onto. That hope. I mean, if you read Mark 13, one of I think the most important passages in the entire Bible, because if it wasn't for what happened, pretty much Mark 13 is, I'll give you a quick rundown because we're running long, but it's Jesus standing outside the temple talking about what's going to happen when the Romans destroy the temple. He's quote unquote predicting the destruction of the temple, but most likely it's a later story of almost what you would call an exegesis, or a parable of if Jesus was here now, what would he do? And I think with the state of Jewish society and culture and the way the Romans were treating them, they needed a figure like Jesus to grasp onto. And we knew that because there's other messianic figures going around at the time. We know of other messianic figures. So Jesus wasn't unique in the fact that he was a messianic figure. What made Jesus unique was he was not preaching armed, rebellion, and his message spread to the Gentiles. So again, Jesus just happened to be in the right place in the right time, or his followers, I guess, would be, because it wasn't so much what Jesus said, it's what people attributed to Jesus' work. I think because Jesus is attributed to a lot of things he never said, but it's people attributed this hope to him that things are really bad. Like in Mark 13, it's horrible what's going on to the Jews, but there's hope that here soon, within your lifetime, because Jesus preached that within your lifetime, I'm going to come back and I'm going to destroy the oppressor. And that brought people hope. And that's what I think made Jesus different, is they attributed that to him. Whether he actually preached that or not, I don't know, but it definitely made him stick out.
And it's still amazing that the Christians don't glom on to the fact that he said the world was going to end within the lifetime of his followers.
Well, he said he'd come back.
Years.
Yeah, I don't think he said he'd come back.
I was confused though, because they say, oh, Jesus said he'd come back, but apparently he did come back. Do they want a third time? I mean, how many times does a guy have to come back for you?
Yeah,
I mean, come on, gee whiz. I'll say that.
I think it's in Mark 9 where Jesus says, some of you will not taste death. Some of you standing here will not taste death till you see the kingdom of God coming, which that literally means until, the second coming, pretty much, or until you see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. So I think Jesus, again, that shows us it's an early tradition, because by the time Mark was written, a lot of those quote unquote eyewitnesses would be dead. A lot of those people Jesus said that to would be dead. And Jesus is saying that passage there directly to his disciples, where he says, some of you standing here will not taste death till you see the kingdom of God coming. So the fact that that's still in there after those people are dead tells you it has, most likely, it doesn't have to be, most likely is a strong early tradition of Jesus. And because Mark's writing down oral traditions. And the fact that made it through tells us it seems to be a tradition that still sticks around to that day, even though most people know it didn't happen. Because Jesus wasn't an all-knowing God. They probably knew he got some things wrong, and that was okay to them, because they're not biblical literalists. They thought Jesus was a human who said some things, and Jesus was trying to inspire people. So Jesus got some things wrong. Whoop-de-doo. You would expect that.
That's another weird thing, that the people of that time take it less literally than some of the people today. And that would be okay if they weren't like in actual positions of influence in this country, which is just sad, but a totally different topic. And dang, we've gone over an hour, and you're like on the road living the tough life. So this is the time where you tell everybody where to find you online, and we'll get all those links in the show notes as well.
Well, obviously I have a personal Facebook page, Matt Kovacs. You can find me there. I'm always writing and just blogging about Jesus, and always having discussions on my Facebook page. But obviously my website is whowasjesusshow.com. You can see the list of experts we have interviewed. That's where you found the debate I did at the church, where you can find our episode at the Ark Encounter we did with David Smalling and Eric Hovind, on whowasjesusshow.com, obviously on Twitter at whowasjesusshow. So we're all over the web, and the name of the documentary is Who Do They Say That I Am? We have a trailer out for it, and we're going to be releasing more content. We were at the Holy Land Experience in Orlando, Florida about a month ago, and did some interviews there and a tour there. And it's almost, if you listen to the Ark episode, it's similar to that. Think of it as a sequel to the Ark Encounter, except it's at the Holy Land Experience in Orlando, Florida, which is owned by the Trinity Broadcast Network. So
I will encourage everybody to listen to that, because I I have talked to a few people living in that Cincinnati area who were there that day, and man, Eric Hovind he believes he's strong with that, but his arguments are great. Arden Ra and him arguing was definitely a highlight, but just being there and going, this thing exists, and somehow someone threw like $100 million at this thing. This is where our priorities are right now. But
it's a huge structure. It costs a lot of money, and my issue with it is it's teaching, and how do I say this respectfully? I don't want to use the word uneducated or ignorant, but it's teaching, and I will use uneducated. I'll just come out and say it. It's teaching uneducated people that this is science. And literally, they make up their own definitions of things that no one else uses outside of the organization. And the only thing certain people are exposed to is this, organization in these terms. And it's dishonest. And I think Ken Ham knows he's dishonest, because not only he's making a buttload of money, but he's had enough experience, unlike his clientele, to know the word he uses for science is not what academia uses. And he knows that. He's been corrected many times. But he still tells the uneducated, well, science means this, so we're doing science, when he knows he's not. So I think it bothers me that it's there, and that a lot of the people who go there are homeschooled. Not that there's anything wrong with homeschooling per se, but they're in an echo chamber. And they're the future of America, and they're only being exposed to this one particular misleading, dishonest, for-profit viewpoint. And it is for profit. I mean, it has to be for profit. They made it for profit so they can get tax benefits. So.
Yeah, that's the part that bothers me, is like the people come to these beliefs on their own, but they had the choice to come to these beliefs, and then they basically don't give the next generation a choice, and they're trying to cut off other options, and it's like, that's not how it works. And it's going to take a lot of people, including you, to get out there to just tell them what's happening, what's really going on. So I do appreciate it, and all links will be included. So if you want to support this show, be like Bobby, Hugh, Teody, and Marissa, go to patreon.com/Zachrilege. Hey, I even put it on there, ZACHRILEGE. Follow me on Twitter, like me on Zacrilegecast on Facebook, and send all hate mail to zacrilege.cast@gmail.com. Thank you to Matt for being on tonight. Stay safe, everybody. If you need to chat, unless you're that Dawkins dude, I'm available. And if you're an atheist and feel alone, you are not alone. Reach out. Let's chat and get that human connectedness that keeps people coming back every Sunday. Stay skeptical. I love all y'all, and I'm sorry I don't have my gong sound anymore, so I have to go gong.